Mike Sanders sat on a park bench, his weathered face a testament to years spent on the unforgiving streets of New York. Around him, a small group of ex-homeless individuals gathered, their eyes fixed on Mike as he spoke. His voice, steady and clear, carried the weight of experience. "I remember the coldest nights," Mike said, his hands gesturing as he talked. "When the wind cut through every layer, and you'd give anything for just one more blanket. But we made it through, didn't we?" Nods of agreement rippled through the group. Some wiped away tears, others smiled in recognition of shared struggles. Unbeknownst to Mike, a passerby had stopped, phone in hand, capturing his words on video. As Mike continued to share his story, the video began its journey across the internet. It started slowly at first, a few shares, a handful of comments, but as hours passed, the momentum built. People from all walks of life found themselves drawn to Mike's raw honesty, his resilience in the face of adversity. By the next morning, Mike's video had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of shares, and countless comments flooded social media platforms. People were captivated by his story, moved by his words, and inspired by his journey from homelessness to hope. The newfound attention caught Mike off guard. His phone, a basic model he'd managed to acquire recently, buzzed incessantly with notifications. Friends from the streets called, amazed at seeing his face plastered across the internet. As the video's popularity soared, media outlets took notice. Local news stations ran segments on the homeless hero, as some had dubbed him. National networks picked up the story, fascinated by Mike's journey and the public's response to it. It wasn't long before a producer from a popular daytime talk show reached out. The invitation was unexpected, a chance for Mike to share his story on a national platform. Despite his initial hesitation, Mike agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to shed light on the struggles faced by those living on the streets. The day of the show arrived, and Mike found himself in a world he'd never imagined. Bright lights, makeup artists, and a bustling production crew surrounded him. As he sat on the plush couch across from the host, cameras rolling, Mike took a deep breath and began to speak. His words, unpolished but genuine, resonated with the studio audience. He spoke of long nights in shelters, of the kindness of strangers, and of the daily fight to maintain dignity in the face of society's indifference. As he talked, the studio fell silent, hanging on his every word. By the end of the segment, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The host, visibly moved, thanked Mike for his bravery in sharing his story. As the credits rolled, Mike was overwhelmed by the response. Audience members approached him, sharing their own stories or simply wanting to shake his hand. In the days that followed, Mike's appearance on the show became another viral sensation. Clips circulated online, sparking discussions about homelessness, social responsibility, and the power of human resilience. Mike found himself thrust into the spotlight, a reluctant symbol of hope for many. Inspired by the outpouring of support and recognizing the platform he'd been given, Mike made a decision. He would use this unexpected fame to make a difference. With the help of a few tech-savvy friends, he set up a website and social media pages dedicated to raising awareness and funds for homeless initiatives. The campaign took off quickly. Donations poured in, ranging from small contributions from individuals to sizable checks from corporations looking to associate with Mike's inspiring story. As the funds grew, so did Mike's vision for how to use them effectively. He organized outreach programs, partnered with existing shelters to expand their services, and even began exploring the possibility of creating new housing solutions for those in need. Through it all, Mike remained grounded, never forgetting where he came from and the people he was fighting for. As his campaign gained traction, Mike found himself at the center of a movement. People looked to him not just for inspiration, but for leadership. It was a role he never expected to fill, but one he embraced with determination and humility. Linda Sanders sat in her dimly lit living room, eyes fixed on the television screen. The face staring back at her was one she hadn't seen in years, yet it was unmistakable. Her son, Mike, was on national television, sharing his story of homelessness and hope. As Mike's words filled the room, Linda's emotions swirled. Pride, shame, regret, and a glimmer of opportunity all vied for dominance. She had walked away from Mike years ago, overwhelmed by her own struggles and unable to provide for him. Now, he was a rising star, his story captivating millions. Linda's mind raced. Perhaps this was her chance to make amends, to be part of Mike's life again. But as she contemplated reaching out, a part of her couldn't help but see the potential benefits of reconnecting with her now famous son. Across town, in a small apartment cluttered with unpaid bills, Chris Sanders watched the same broadcast. His brother's face on the screen stirred a mix of emotions: surprise, jealousy, and a spark of opportunistic interest. Chris had always seen himself as the one destined for success in the family. Now, his homeless brother was the one in the spotlight. Chris's mind quickly shifted to how he could leverage this situation. He began to craft a narrative in his head. The supportive brother, always there in spirit, if not in person. He could help Mike navigate this new world of fame and fortune. After all, families should stick together, right? The next day, both Linda and Chris independently decided to reach out to Mike. Linda crafted a heartfelt message, carefully worded to express remorse for the past and hope for the future. She hit send, her heart pounding as she waited for a response. Chris took a different approach. He found Mike's newly created social media accounts and left public comments, full of brotherly pride and offers of support. He made sure his messages were visible to all, painting himself as the caring sibling ready to stand by his brother's side. Mike, still adjusting to his newfound fame, was blindsided by the sudden reappearance of his family. He stared at his mother's message, a whirlwind of emotions, threatening to overwhelm him. The wounds of abandonment were still fresh, despite the years that had passed. Chris's public declarations of support left Mike feeling even more conflicted. He remembered the childhood squabbles, the times Chris had belittled his dreams. Now, his brother was suddenly his biggest cheerleader. The contrast was jarring. As days passed, Mike found himself torn between hope and skepticism. Part of him yearned for the family connection he had been missing for so long. The idea of reconciliation, of having a support system during this overwhelming time, was tempting. Yet, a nagging voice in the back of his mind urged caution. The timing of their reappearance was suspicious. Why now, when he was suddenly in the public eye? Were their intentions genuine, or were they simply looking to benefit from his unexpected success? Mike decided to tread carefully. He responded to Linda's message with a brief, non-committal reply, agreeing to meet but setting clear boundaries. To Chris, he sent a private message, acknowledging his public support but expressing his desire to keep family matters out of the spotlight. As he prepared for these reunions, Mike couldn't shake his unease. He had learned valuable lessons about trust and self-reliance during his time on the streets. Those instincts were now at war with his desire for family connections. The day of his meeting with Linda arrived. Mike chose a quiet cafe, neutral ground where he felt he could maintain some emotional distance. As he waited, his mind raced through possible scenarios. Would she try to explain her absence? Would she ask for forgiveness? Or would she have ulterior motives hidden behind a facade of maternal concern? When Linda walked in, Mike was struck by how much older she looked. The years had not been kind to her either. Their initial interaction was awkward, filled with hesitant smiles and uncertain glances. As they began to talk, Mike found himself constantly analyzing her words, searching for hidden agendas. Later that week, Chris insisted on meeting at a trendy restaurant, a place that screamed of his desire to be associated with Mike's new status. Throughout the dinner, Chris oscillated between expressions of pride in Mike's achievements and subtle hints about how he could help manage Mike's new career. As these interactions unfolded, Mike felt increasingly conflicted. The longing for family warred with his street-honed instincts. He wanted to believe in the possibility of reconciliation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their sudden reappearance than met the eye. In quiet moments, Mike found himself questioning everything. Were Linda's tears genuine remorse or a calculated performance? Was Chris's enthusiastic support sincere or a ploy to gain access to Mike's newfound resources? The answers weren't clear, and Mike realized that navigating these murky familial waters might be even more challenging than surviving on the streets. Mike sat across from Linda in a small cafe, the aroma of coffee filling the air between them. Linda leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest, as she peppered Mike with questions about his new life. "So, tell me about this TV appearance," Linda said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Was it nerve-wracking being in front of all those cameras?" Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It was different," he replied, his tone measured. "But I was more focused on getting the message out about homelessness." Linda nodded, but her follow-up question revealed where her true interest lay. "I bet you're getting all sorts of offers now, aren't you? Any book deals in the works?" As the conversation continued, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that Linda was more interested in the trappings of his newfound fame than in reconnecting with him as a son. Her questions consistently veered towards his public appearances, social media following, and potential financial opportunities. When Mike tried to steer the conversation towards more personal topics, how she'd been, what she'd been doing all these years, Linda's responses were vague and hurried before she quickly returned to discussing his rising profile. By the end of their meeting, Mike felt a heaviness in his chest. The mother he'd hoped to reconnect with seemed more like a fan chasing a celebrity than a parent trying to mend a broken relationship. A few days later, Mike found himself in a sleek office, listening to his brother Chris outline an ambitious project. Chris's eyes gleamed as he gestured towards a whiteboard covered in flowcharts and figures. "Think about it, Mike," Chris said enthusiastically. "A nationwide campaign to raise awareness about homelessness. We'll use your story as the centerpiece. I've already got some sponsors lined up who are interested." Mike frowned, studying the plans. "It looks big," he said cautiously. "But isn't this more about marketing than actually helping people?" Chris waved off Mike's concerns. "That's how these things work, bro. We need to build the brand first. Trust me, I know how to handle this stuff." As Chris continued to explain his vision, Mike's unease grew. The focus seemed to be more on creating a marketable image than on providing tangible help to those in need. Chris's ideas revolved around high-profile events, celebrity endorsements, and merchandising opportunities. When Mike tried to suggest more grassroots approaches or direct aid programs, Chris dismissed them as small-scale and not marketable enough. It became increasingly clear that Chris saw Mike's story as a product to be packaged and sold, rather than a platform for real change. The meeting left Mike with a sour taste in his mouth. He'd hoped that working with his brother might be a way to rebuild their relationship while doing some good. Instead, he felt like Chris was trying to turn him into a brand, with little regard for the actual cause he cared about. Later that week, Mike found himself in yet another meeting, this time with Rachel, a popular social media influencer. She'd reached out, expressing interest in featuring Mike's story in a documentary series she was producing. Rachel's office was a stark contrast to Chris's, all soft lighting and motivational quotes on the walls. She greeted Mike with a practiced smile and a firm handshake. "Mike, I'm so excited about this project," Rachel gushed. "Your story is exactly what we need to really make an impact." As Rachel outlined her vision for the documentary, Mike listened carefully. On the surface, it sounded promising. a deep dive into the realities of homelessness, featuring stories of struggle and triumph. But as the discussion progressed, Mike began to notice troubling patterns. Rachel seemed more concerned with crafting a narrative that would generate views and engagement than with accurately representing the complexities of homelessness. "We'll need to reshape some parts of your story," Rachel said casually. "Maybe play up the despair a bit more in the beginning. Audiences love a good rock-bottom moment." Mike felt a knot forming in his stomach. "But that's not really how it happened," he protested. "There were tough times, sure, but also moments of community and hope." Rachel's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Trust me, Mike. I know what sells. We need to give the audience what they want if we're going to make a real impact." As the meeting wore on, Mike found himself increasingly uncomfortable. Rachel's suggestions all seemed designed to sensationalize his experiences, to turn his life into a neat, marketable package. The nuances of his journey, the small kindnesses and daily struggles that had shaped him, were being stripped away in favor of a more dramatic narrative. By the time he left Rachel's office, Mike felt drained. He'd entered these meetings with his mother, his brother, and now Rachel, hoping to find genuine connections and opportunities to make a difference. Instead, he was beginning to feel like a commodity. His life story, something to be exploited for others' gain. As he walked home, the bustling city around him, a stark contrast to his former life on its streets, Mike couldn't help but wonder. In this new world of opportunity opening up before him, was there anyone who saw him for who he really was, rather than what they could gain from him? The park bench was hard and cold, a familiar discomfort that Mike found oddly comforting. Beside him sat Tony, his weathered face a map of shared experiences from their time on the streets. Tony's eyes, sharp and knowing, focused on Mike as he spoke. "Fame's a tricky beast, Mike," Tony said, his voice gravelly from years of rough living. "It'll smile at you with one face and stab you with the other." Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Tony. It's just, I thought this would be different. I thought I could use this attention to really make a change." Tony nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You can, but you gotta be careful. These new friends of yours, they see dollar signs, not the guy I know who'd share his last sandwich with a stranger." Mike listened, torn between the allure of his new life and the wisdom in Tony's words. Part of him wanted to brush off the warnings, to believe that his newfound connections were genuine, that his family's sudden interest was born of love rather than opportunism. "Maybe you're being too cynical," Mike suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "People can change, right?" Tony's laugh was short and harsh. "Sure, people can change, but leopards don't change their spots overnight, and vultures don't turn into doves just 'cause there's a feast on the table." As they talked, Mike found himself defending his new relationships, even as doubt gnawed at him. He spoke of the projects he was planning with Chris, the documentary Rachel wanted to make, the reconciliation he hoped for with his mother. Tony listened patiently, but his skepticism was evident. "Just remember where you came from, Mike, and remember who was there for you when you had nothing. Those are the people who matter." Despite his initial resistance, Mike found Tony's words staying with him long after they parted ways. They echoed in his mind as he attended glitzy events, sat for interviews, and met with potential sponsors. At a launch party for his new social media campaign, Mike found himself surrounded by a sea of unfamiliar faces. Influencers, celebrities, and business moguls mingled, all eager to be associated with the inspiring story of the ex-homeless man turned social media sensation. Rachel was there, expertly working the room, dropping Mike's name in every conversation. Chris hovered nearby, schmoozing with potential investors. Even Linda had managed to secure an invitation, basking in the reflected glow of her son's fame. As Mike navigated the crowd, shaking hands and smiling for photos, he felt increasingly disconnected. The conversations were superficial, focused on follower counts and engagement rates rather than the real issues he wanted to address. A young influencer, her smile dazzling and practiced, cornered Mike by the bar. "We simply must collab," she gushed. "Your story, my audience. We could really raise awareness." Mike nodded politely, but inwardly he wondered, awareness of what? The real struggles of homelessness, or just the carefully curated version of his story that had captured the public's imagination? As the night wore on, Mike found himself retreating to a quiet corner, observing the scene before him. He watched as Chris laughingly promised exclusive access to Mike's story to 3 different journalists. He saw Rachel skillfully steering conversations towards her upcoming documentary series. He noticed Linda holding court with a group of socialites, embellishing tales of Mike's childhood. In that moment, Tony's words came rushing back. These people, with their air kisses and empty promises, their strategic alliances and calculated gestures, were they really his friends? Did they care about him, or just what he represented? Mike thought back to the genuine connections he'd formed on the streets, the shared meals, the warnings of dangerous areas, the small kindnesses that had kept him going in his darkest hours. There was an authenticity there that seemed glaringly absent in this glittering world he now inhabited. As the party continued around him, Mike felt a profound sense of loneliness. He was surrounded by people, yet he'd never felt more isolated. The contrast between his old life and this new one had never been starker, and he found himself questioning every decision that had led him to this point. A waiter passed by, offering champagne. Mike declined, suddenly yearning for the simplicity of his past life. The challenges had been immense, the hardships real, but at least he'd known where he stood. Here, in this world of smoke and mirrors, he felt adrift. As the night drew to a close, Mike made his excuses and slipped out early. The cool night air was a relief after the stifling atmosphere of the party. As he walked home, the city streets quiet and empty, he found himself at a crossroads. He had been given an incredible opportunity, a platform to effect real change, but at what cost? Was he willing to sacrifice his authenticity to become the product that everyone seemed to want him to be? Or was there a way to navigate this new world while staying true to himself and his experiences? The answers weren't clear, but as Mike made his way home, he knew one thing for certain. Something had to change. He couldn't continue to ignore the nagging feeling that he was losing himself in this whirlwind of fame and opportunism. It was time to reassess, to remember why he had started this journey in the first place, and to find a way to make a real difference on his own terms. Mike's new apartment felt cavernous and impersonal as he prepared for dinner with Linda and Chris. The gleaming kitchen appliances and designer furniture were a far cry from the shelters and street corners he once called home. As he set the table, his movements were mechanical, his mind elsewhere. The doorbell chimed, its melodic tone echoing through the spacious living room. Mike took a deep breath, steeling himself before opening the door. Linda stood there, a forced smile on her face, a bottle of wine in her hand. Chris was right behind her, his eyes darting around, taking in the upscale surroundings. "Mike, honey," Linda cooed, air kissing his cheek. "This place is simply marvelous." Chris whistled low. "Moving up in the world, bro. Nice digs." Mike ushered them in, trying to ignore the way they both seemed to be appraising everything they saw. He led them to the dining room, where a simple but elegant meal awaited. As they settled into their seats, an awkward silence fell over the table. Mike cleared his throat. "So, how have you both been?" Linda launched into a monologue about her recent activities, but Mike couldn't help noticing how every anecdote seemed to circle back to his newfound fame. "And then I told my book club, that's my son they're talking about on the news," she said, beaming. Chris, meanwhile, kept steering the conversation towards business opportunities. You know, Mike, I've been thinking, with your story and my business acumen, we could really build something big here. As the evening progressed, Mike found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable. He had hoped this dinner would be a chance to reconnect, to rebuild the family bonds that had been broken for so long. Instead, it felt like a business meeting, with him as the product being discussed. Linda's questions became more pointed as the wine flowed. So, darling, have you thought about what you're going to do with all this money you're making? You know, your father and I could use a little help with our mortgage. Mike nearly choked on his food. Mom, the money isn't really... Chris jumped in. What Mom means is, we're all family here. We should be looking out for each other, right? Speaking of which, I've got this great investment opportunity. As Chris launched into his pitch, Mike felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had invited them here hoping to reconnect, to maybe start healing old wounds. Instead, he felt like a cash cow being sized up for slaughter. Guys, Mike interrupted, his voice tight. Can we talk about something else? How about we talk about the old times or... Linda waved her hand dismissively. Oh, honey, the past is the past. We should focus on the future, your future specifically. Have you thought about writing a book? I have a friend in publishing who'd love to meet you. Mike's shoulders sagged. Every attempt to steer the conversation towards genuine connection was thwarted, replaced by talk of money, fame, and opportunities to capitalize on his story. As the evening wore on, Mike found himself retreating into silence, responding with non-committal grunts and nods. He watched as Linda and Chris dominated the conversation, their eyes gleaming with barely concealed excitement at the prospects his newfound fame presented. When Linda suggested they all pose for a family selfie for the fans, Mike felt something inside him snap. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I think it's getting late, he said, his voice strained. Maybe we should call it a night. Linda and Chris exchanged glances, seemingly oblivious to Mike's discomfort. As he showed them out, their parting words were all about future plans, collaborations, and how they should do this again soon. As the door closed behind them, Mike leaned against it, feeling drained. The apartment, which had seemed so empty before, now felt suffocating. The remnants of the dinner, half-empty wine glasses and picked-over plates, seemed to mock his hopes for a genuine family reunion. He walked to the large window overlooking the city, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The glittering lights below reminded him of the shiny, superficial world he now inhabited. For the first time since his rise to fame, Mike found himself longing for the simplicity of his old life. At least then, he knew where he stood and who his real friends were. As he stood there, staring at his reflection superimposed over the cityscape, Mike realized he had some serious thinking to do. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: something had to change. The park was quieter than usual as Mike made his way to the familiar bench where Tony waited. The early morning mist hung low, shrouding the city in a dreamlike haze. As Mike approached, Tony's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. "Rough night?" Tony asked, scooting over to make room. Mike sank onto the bench with a heavy sigh. "You could say that. Family dinner." Tony nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. Family's complicated, especially when money and fame enter the picture. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, watching as the city slowly came to life around them. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice low and troubled. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Tony. This whole fame thing, it's not what I thought it would be. Everyone wants a piece of me, but no one seems to care about the actual issues." Tony listened intently, his eyes never leaving Mike's face. "That's the game, kid. They see dollar signs, not people. You gotta be careful." As they talked, Mike found himself opening up about his frustrations, the superficial relationships, the constant pressure to perform, the feeling that he was losing sight of his original goals. Tony listened patiently, offering occasional words of wisdom drawn from a lifetime of hard-earned experience. "Remember why you started this?" Tony said, his voice gruff but kind. "You wanted to make a difference, right? Don't let them turn your story into just another product to sell." As their conversation drew to a close, Mike felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tony's words had cut through the noise and confusion, reminding him of what truly mattered. Just as Mike was about to leave, his phone buzzed insistently. Rachel's name flashed on the screen. With a resigned sigh, he answered. Rachel's voice came through, bubbly and enthusiastic as ever. "Mike, I've got amazing news. There's this charity gala next month. All the biggest names will be there. I've managed to get you a spot as a speaker. It's the perfect opportunity to promote our documentary." Mike hesitated, Tony's advice still ringing in his ears. "I don't know, Rachel. Is this really about raising awareness, or is it just about generating buzz?" Rachel's tone shifted, becoming slightly sharper. "Mike, honey, that's how this works. We need the buzz to get people to care. Trust me, this is how you make a real impact." As Rachel continued to extol the virtues of the event, Mike found himself torn. Part of him knew she was right. These high-profile events did bring attention to causes, but another part, the part that remembered cold nights on the streets and the real faces of homelessness, balked at the idea of turning his experiences into a glitzy performance for the elite. "I'll think about it," Mike said finally, cutting Rachel off mid-pitch. "I need some time to consider." Rachel's disappointment was palpable, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, take your time. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around every day." As Mike ended the call, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought about Rachel's slick pitches and carefully crafted image. He thought about Chris's grand plans and Linda's thinly veiled requests for money. Then he thought about Tony and the people he'd left behind on the streets. In that moment, Mike made a decision. He needed to do something real, something that actually helped people, rather than just talking about helping. He pulled out his phone again, but this time he didn't call Rachel, or Chris, or any of his new high-profile contacts. Instead, he called the local homeless shelter where he'd spent so many nights. "Hey, it's Mike," he said when the volunteer coordinator answered. "I was wondering if you guys could use an extra pair of hands this week." The coordinator's surprise and gratitude were evident in her voice. As they worked out the details, Mike felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. This, actually doing something. No cameras, no social media, just real work. This was what he needed. As he ended the call, Mike looked back at the bench where Tony had been sitting. The old man was gone, but his advice lingered. Mike smiled to himself, feeling for the first time in weeks that he was back on the right path. He started walking, not towards his new apartment with its sleek furnishings and city views, but towards the shelter. There was work to be done, and for once, Mike was looking forward to it. The community center buzzed with activity as Mike moved through the space, directing volunteers and checking last-minute details. The walls, once drab and institutional, now bore colorful posters and information boards about homelessness and community support. This event, a grassroots effort to raise awareness and provide direct aid, was a far cry from the glitzy galas and media spectacles that had dominated Mike's life recently. As he helped set up a clothing donation station, Mike caught sight of Linda and Chris entering the building. Their presence was a surprise. He hadn't expected them to show up for something so unglamorous. Linda's eyes widened as she took in the scene. "Oh, Mike," she said, her voice a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "I thought this was going to be a proper event. Where are the cameras? The sponsors?" Mike took a deep breath, steeling himself. "This is a proper event, Mom. We're here to actually help people, not just talk about it." Chris, meanwhile, was frowning at his phone. "Bro, you didn't even post about this on social media. How are you going to leverage this for your brand?" The old Mike might have faltered in the face of their disapproval, might have second-guessed his decisions. But the weeks of discomfort and soul-searching had strengthened his resolve. "This isn't about my brand," Mike said firmly. "It's about doing something real, something that actually makes a difference." Linda's face fell into a practiced pout. "But honey, think of all the good you could do with more publicity, more money. If you just listen to our ideas." "No, Mom," Mike interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I've listened to your ideas. I've tried doing things your way. But that's not why I started this. I'm not here to be a celebrity or make a fortune. I'm here to help people who are in the situation I was in not too long ago." Chris scoffed, crossing his arms. "Come on, Mike. Don't be naive. You've got a golden opportunity here. Why waste it on this small-time stuff?" Mike felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. "This small-time stuff is what matters, Chris. These are real people with real needs. Not everything has to be about making money or getting famous." As Mike spoke, he noticed a small crowd gathering around them. Volunteers and early arrivals were watching the exchange with interest. Among them, Mike spotted Tony, who gave him a subtle nod of approval. Linda, noticing the attention, quickly plastered on a smile. "Of course, dear. We're just trying to help. You know we support you no matter what." But Mike wasn't fooled by the sudden change in tone. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was already trying to spin this into a positive story for any watching ears. "Look," Mike said, lowering his voice. "I appreciate that you both came. If you want to stay and help, you're welcome to. But if you're just here to try and turn this into something it's not, then maybe it's better if you go." For a moment, hurt flashed across Linda's face. Real hurt, not the performative kind Mike had grown accustomed to seeing. Chris's expression hardened, a mix of anger and something that might have been shame. "Fine," Chris said shortly. "Clearly you don't need our help. Come on, Mom." As they turned to leave, Mike felt a pang of regret. He hadn't wanted it to end like this. But as he watched them go, he also felt a sense of relief. For the first time in months, he felt like he was truly standing on solid ground. Tony approached as Linda and Chris disappeared through the doors. "You did good, kid," he said, clapping Mike on the shoulder. "It ain't easy standing up to family, but sometimes it's necessary." Mike nodded, grateful for the support. "Thanks, Tony. I just hope I'm doing the right thing." Tony's weathered face creased into a smile. "Look around you. You're helping people. That's always the right thing." As if on cue, a group of people began to file into the center, individuals and families who had fallen on hard times, who needed the kind of help Mike once needed himself. Seeing their faces, tired but hopeful, Mike knew he had made the right choice. He turned to Tony with a renewed sense of purpose. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's get to work." The community center hummed with activity as the event reached its peak. People from all walks of life mingled, sharing stories and resources. Mike stood at the podium, surveying the scene with a mix of pride and humility. This was what he had envisioned when he first decided to share his story. Real people helping real people. Taking a deep breath, Mike began his speech. His voice, clear and steady, carried through the room. "A year ago, I was sleeping on these very streets," he started, his words devoid of the polished rhetoric he'd been coached to use in media appearances. "I know what it's like to feel invisible, to wonder where your next meal is coming from. But I also know the power of community, of small kindnesses that can change a life." As Mike spoke, he noticed a shift in the audience. Unlike the glazed expressions he often saw at high-profile events, These faces were engaged, nodding in understanding, or blinking back tears of recognition. My story went viral, and suddenly everyone wanted a piece of it, Mike continued, his honesty palpable. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. Today isn't about me or my story. It's about all of us coming together to make a real difference. From the corner of his eye, Mike saw Linda and Chris slip into the back of the room. Their expressions were unreadable, but at least they had returned. He chose not to acknowledge them, focusing instead on the message he wanted to convey. As Mike concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. But what happened next took him by surprise. A man stood up, his clothes worn but clean, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I want to say something, the man said, his voice wavering slightly. My name's Dave. 6 months ago, I was living in my car. I saw one of Mike's videos and it gave me hope, made me feel like I wasn't alone. Today, I've got a job and a room of my own. It ain't much, but it's a start. And I'm here today to give back, to help others like people helped me. Dave's words opened a floodgate. One by one, people stood up, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. Some had been inspired by Mike's journey, others by the kindness of strangers or the support of community organizations. Each story was a testament to the human spirit and the power of compassion. Mike stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed by the outpouring of experiences. This was the impact he had hoped to make, not through carefully curated social media posts or sensationalized documentaries, but through genuine connection and shared experiences. As the impromptu storytelling session continued, Mike noticed movement at the back of the room. Linda was making her way to the front, her face a mask of determination. For a moment, Mike tensed, unsure of what to expect. Linda reached the podium, her eyes meeting Mike's for a brief moment before she turned to face the crowd. I'm Mike's mother, she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I haven't always been there for him. In fact, I've made a lot of mistakes. The room fell silent, all eyes on Linda. Mike watched, his heart racing, as his mother continued. Seeing all of you here today, hearing your stories, it's made me realize how much I've missed, how much I don't understand about what my son has been through. Linda's voice cracked slightly. I came here today thinking about how to turn this into a PR opportunity. But now I see that I've been part of the problem. I'm sorry, Mike. I'm sorry to all of you. I want to learn. I want to do better. The sincerity in Linda's voice was unmistakable. Mike felt a lump form in his throat as he watched his mother, vulnerable and honest for the first time in years. From the back of the room, Chris cleared his throat. Yeah, what she said. I've been an ass, Mike. I'm sorry. The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of these confessions hanging in the air. Then slowly, applause began to build. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping of a formal event, but the genuine, heartfelt appreciation of a community acknowledging growth and honesty. As the applause died down, Mike stepped forward, placing a hand on his mother's shoulder. Thank you, he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. The event continued, but with a renewed energy. People approached Linda and Chris, sharing stories and perspectives. Mike watched as his family, for perhaps the first time, truly engaged with the realities of homelessness and community support. As the day drew to a close, Mike felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This event hadn't gone as planned. It had gone better. Real connections had been made, real understanding fostered. And perhaps most surprisingly, it had brought about a genuine change in his own family. Mike knew there was still a long road ahead, both in his work and in his personal relationships. But for the first time in months, he felt truly hopeful about the future. As the community center event wound down, Mike found himself surrounded by a small group of volunteers and attendees, all eager to discuss next steps and future initiatives. The energy in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the manufactured excitement of the high-profile events he'd grown accustomed to. Just as Mike was about to suggest forming a committee to plan their next event, his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Excusing himself, he stepped away to answer the call. "Mike Sanders?" An unfamiliar voice greeted him. "This is Jonathan Reeves from Horizon Investments. I was at your event today. Incredible work, truly inspiring." Mike's guard immediately went up. He'd dealt with enough opportunistic investors over the past few months to be wary. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. How can I help you?" "Please, call me Jonathan." The voice continued smoothly. "I'll cut to the chase, Mike. We at Horizon are very interested in supporting your work. We believe your grassroots approach could be scaled up significantly with the right backing. I'd like to discuss a potential investment in your initiative." Mike's mind raced. On the surface, this sounded like exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been hoping for, a chance to expand his work and help more people. But something in Jonathan's tone made him hesitate. "That's very generous," Mike replied cautiously. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Jonathan launched into a pitch about nationwide programs, corporate partnerships, and media campaigns. As he spoke, Mike felt a familiar unease settling in his stomach. The words were different, but the underlying message was the same as always. Bigger, flashier, more profitable. "Of course," Jonathan concluded, "we'd need to make some adjustments to your current approach. Polish things up a bit, make it more appealing to a wider audience. But think of the impact we could have." Mike glanced back at the community center, where volunteers were cleaning up and chatting animatedly about the day's successes. He thought about the real connections made, the genuine change he'd seen in people's eyes, including his own family's. "Mr. Reeves." "Jonathan," Mike said, his voice firm. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think it's the right fit for what we're trying to do here. Our strength is in our community focus and authenticity. I'm not interested in polishing that away." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Jonathan spoke again, his tone had cooled noticeably. "I see. Well, if you change your mind, you have my number. But I'd advise you to think carefully about this, Mike. Opportunities like this don't come along every day." As Mike ended the call, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Had he just made a huge mistake? Was he letting his personal feelings get in the way of a chance to do more good? Lost in thought, he didn't notice Tony approaching until the older man spoke. "Looked like a serious call," Tony observed, his eyes sharp and knowing. Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, it was an investor. Wanted to scale up our operation. Talking about nationwide programs, corporate partnerships." Tony nodded slowly. "Sounds impressive. So why do you look like someone just offered you a sandwich filled with sand?" Despite himself, Mike chuckled. "Because I turned him down. And now I'm wondering if I made the right call." Tony was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "You know," he said finally, "I've been on these streets a long time. Seen a lot of people come through with big plans and bigger promises. Most of them disappear as quick as they came, but the ones that stick around, that make a real difference, they're the ones who keep it real, who remember what it's like down here." Mike nodded, feeling some of his doubt dissipate. "Thanks, Tony. I needed to hear that." As they turned back towards the community center, Mike's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Chris calling. "Hey, bro." Chris's voice came through, sounding uncharacteristically subdued. "Listen, I've been thinking about today. About everything, really. I want to help. For real this time. No angles, no schemes. Just tell me what you need." Mike felt a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, Chris," That means a lot. Why don't you come by tomorrow? We can talk about it." As he ended the call, Mike felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead might not be as glamorous or lucrative as some would like, but it felt right. It felt real. Tony clapped him on the shoulder. "All right, kid, let's finish cleaning up. Tomorrow's another day, and there's still plenty of work to do." Mike nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Yes, there was work to do, but for the first time in a long while, he was genuinely looking forward to it. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Mike arrived at the community center the next morning. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on his mind, but there was a newfound clarity to his thoughts. As he unlocked the doors, he was surprised to see Chris already waiting outside, a tray of coffee in hand. "Thought you might need this," Chris said, offering Mike a cup. "Figured we'd be in for a long day." Mike accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, studying his brother's face. There was something different about Chris, a sincerity in his eyes that had been missing for years. As they entered the center and began setting up for the day, Mike filled Chris in on the plans they'd discussed the night before, expanding their outreach programs, setting up a job training initiative, and working on securing more stable housing options for those in need. Chris listened intently, occasionally offering suggestions or asking questions. It was a far cry from his previous attempts to help, which had always seemed more focused on publicity and profit than actual assistance. As the morning wore on, volunteers began to trickle in, many of them returnees from the previous day's event. Mike was in the middle of outlining the day's tasks when he spotted a familiar face entering the center, Linda. She looked different from the polished, camera-ready mother he'd grown accustomed to seeing. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face free of makeup, and she was dressed in comfortable, practical clothing. "Mom," Mike said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Linda shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the room before settling on Mike. I want to help," she said softly, "if you'll let me." For a moment, Mike was speechless. He glanced at Chris, who looked equally taken aback. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Of course, we can always use more hands." As Linda joined the group of volunteers, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening. His family, who had been so focused on exploiting his story for their own gain, were now here, ready to get their hands dirty and do real work. The day progressed, filled with the kind of mundane but essential tasks that keep community organizations running: sorting donations, preparing meals, offering counseling and support to those who needed it. Mike watched as Chris threw himself into the work, his natural charisma put to good use in making newcomers feel welcome. Linda, initially hesitant, soon found her niche helping with administrative tasks and offering a sympathetic ear to those who needed to talk. As the afternoon wore on, Mike found himself in a quiet corner of the center, taking a moment to process everything that had happened. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Tony approaching until the older man spoke. "Quite a change, huh?" Tony said, nodding towards Chris and Linda, who were engrossed in conversation with a group of volunteers. Mike nodded, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," he admitted, "for them to reveal that this is all part of some new scheme." Tony chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Maybe it is," he said. "Or maybe they've finally seen what you've been trying to show them all along." Before Mike could respond, he was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the center. A group of people had just entered, led by a face Mike recognized from countless TV appearances and magazine covers: Jonathan Reeves, the investor he'd turned down the day before. Mike tensed, preparing for a confrontation. But as Jonathan approached, there was none of the smooth, calculated charm he'd displayed on the phone. Instead, he looked humbled. "Mr. Sanders," Jonathan said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology. After our conversation yesterday, I decided to do some research into your work. I spent the night talking to people you've helped, reading about your journey. I realize now that I was wrong in my approach." Mike shook Jonathan's hand, still wary but willing to listen. Jonathan continued, gesturing to the group behind him. "These are some of my colleagues from Horizon Investments. We'd like to volunteer today if you'll have us. And if you're willing, I'd like to discuss how we can support your work on your terms, not ours." For a moment, Mike was speechless. He looked around the room, at Chris and Linda, working side by side with those they once would have ignored, at Tony, whose knowing smile spoke volumes, at the volunteers and community members who had come together to make a real difference. In that moment, Mike realized that this messy, imperfect, deeply human effort was what he had been fighting for all along. Not fame, not fortune, but the chance to create genuine change, one person at a time. "Welcome," Mike said finally, a smile spreading across his face. "We can always use more help. Let's talk about how we can work together, all of us, to make a real difference." As the day drew to a close, Mike stood at the center of a circle of people, family, friends, former strangers turned allies. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Mike felt truly hopeful. He had set out to change the world and had ended up changing himself and those around him in ways he never could have imagined. As the group dispersed, each heading home with plans to return the next day, Mike caught Tony's eye. The old man gave him a nod of approval, and Mike felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was just the beginning, he realized. The real work, the hard, rewarding, transformative work, was only just starting, and he was ready for it.